He was right in saying that diplomacy is a long-term effort. What he needed to justify then is why is it right for us to wait so long when people are being shelled by tanks, ladies and gentlemen, when there's aerial bombardments of cities going on, ladies and gentlemen, when yesterday 59 kids innocently were hit by shells by the military army of Syria, ladies and gentlemen. They needed to tell us why it's justified to wait so long. But more importantly, right, he never rebutted Rohit's analysis as to how this person has no incentive to give in to diplomatic pressure, ladies and gentlemen. Extensive analysis came from Rohit to you that he has absolutely no incentive to make any concession whatsoever, ladies and gentlemen, because he knows without international military intervention, he will be able to repress this uprising in a matter of years, ladies and gentlemen. He has enough money stored outside to necessarily last that long. So we don't think diplomatic pressures will work, ladies and gentlemen. They need to give us more analysis on that end, ladies and gentlemen. But more importantly, right, a quick housekeeping issue before I move on to my issues. He said, well, if you're talking about peacekeeping, when there's no UN consensus, how will you do peacekeeping? We think peacekeeping happens post-conflict. We see no incentive for Russia post-conflict to drop any measures to stabilize Syria itself, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that point is moot. Let's talk about my few rebuttals towards them. First, about urban warfare. We think on the first level, ladies and gentlemen, when you take out high importance targets like tanks, like armored vehicles, like airfields, ladies and gentlemen, their ability to cause collateral damage towards Syria reduces. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we said that we are using the FSA to carry out this, which means, ladies and gentlemen, they are capable of understanding the terrain of the cities. We think, ladies and gentlemen, they'll be able to do just fine. More importantly, we have done well in urban warfare in the past. In Iraq, for instance, ladies and gentlemen, we were able to minimize casualties to a very large extent, ladies and gentlemen, in the process of carrying out urban warfare. But lastly, we think, ladies and gentlemen, the moment we start enticing defections from the army, the sort of resistance that we will face will also rapidly go down. Rohit gave you the incentives for defections that exist under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, when he said that the Sunni majority army has no ideological allegiance to Bashar al-Assad. They don't want to kill their own Sunni brothers. The only reason they do so is because in status quo they are scared. Because they are scared of the repercussions that will fall upon their family, ladies and gentlemen, if this uprising is unsuccessful, and all trends in status quo points towards the uprising being unsuccessful. So we think, ladies and gentlemen, that our whole point about defectors stands, ladies and gentlemen. They haven't proven why they will not be more defectors. The next issue, ladies and gentlemen, was about the civilian casualties. We said, ladies and gentlemen, that on the first level, we are going to be able to minimize them. That's what we've seen in past trends, but we think some amount is inevitable. You need to prove how you will show in less number of people dying when Bashar al-Assad has people bombing cities, ladies and gentlemen, on a daily basis. That's the fundamental difference on both sides. Let's talk about the two things I'll bring to you. The first time, ladies and gentlemen, I'll talk to you about the post-conflict scenario within Syria. Before that, yes.
Can you really sustain a protracted war when 3 weeks into the Libyan conflict, NATO ran out of bullets and the US isn't willing to risk another debacle like Iraq, and while they've abandoned virtually any kind of nation building in Libya right now?
Ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that's true. We think NATO has sufficient capability to carry out a protracted war, but we don't think this war will last long anyway. We think the moment we take out the high-profile targets like airfields, like anti-tanks and armored vehicles, we think people will begin defecting, ladies and gentlemen. We have seen signs of that. That's why the Free Syrian Army came into existence in the first place. We think that, ladies and gentlemen, this won't be a very long operation. Even if it is, we think the global community together has the capability. Let's talk about the post-conflict scenario and why we are better. On the first level, ladies and gentlemen, we think we are the people who empower them, given that most of the tasks of carrying out this resistance against Assad is handed down to people like the Free Syrian Army in our paradigm. We think, ladies and gentlemen, we are the people who necessarily give the people on the ground ownership of this rebellion, ladies and gentlemen. And moreover, we think it's people on the ground who are asking for international aid, ladies and gentlemen, in the form of surgical strikes against Bashar al-Assad. We think under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, the sort of ownership that these people have is much greater. But secondly, seeing timely international support makes people more malleable to the international community, ladies and gentlemen. When they see that the international community is willing to stand up to these people and stand up for these people, ladies and gentlemen, we think these people are more likely to then see the international community more favorably, ladies and gentlemen. They're more likely to be amenable to the sort of pressures put by the international community later on. We think then, ladies and gentlemen, the National Transition Council of Syria, for instance, who is currently united, we think under our paradigm we are going to strengthen it by taking people from the minority Alawite community as well, so as to put forward a united and uniform front to the people of Syria. We think, ladies and gentlemen, when the NTC sees that the international community has come on time and helped them, we think they're more likely to be malleable to the sort of reforms we suggest to them, then more likely to cooperate with the international community a lot more. That's much better under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we told you about the minorities itself. We think first and foremost under our model, given the fact that we create an NTC that reflects the demographics of Syria, we think minorities will be protected better under our paradigm, as opposed to letting this be, ladies and gentlemen, where the resentment towards the minority increases. Because as Bashar al-Assad continues to carry out atrocities on its people, ladies and gentlemen, that's where the resentment against the Alawite community increases massively within Syria, ladies and gentlemen. That's what makes it extremely difficult for these divides to later on be seen, ladies and gentlemen. We think then under our paradigm, we make it much, much better. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's under our paradigm in terms of refugees, right? We think on the first level, because the conflict goes on for much lesser, because they've said that diplomacy is a long-term process, we think the number of refugees will be much, much greater in that process, ladies and gentlemen, as more and more people continue to get born. So we think it's under our paradigm that we minimize the number of refugees. But what about the number of refugees that will exist in both number of paradigms? We think, ladies and gentlemen, Turkey has already expressed interest in letting these refugees in and in taking care of these refugees. They're doing it in status quo, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, once we have an internationally coordinated effort, we have international funding to take care of these refugees, not Turkish funding, ladies and gentlemen. So we think there's greater incentive for people to go in and take them in. We think it's under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, that the number of refugees will be lesser because this conflict will end soon. Because they haven't shown, ladies and gentlemen, what's the timeline for this conflict ending under their paradigm. We think it's under their paradigm that this conflict goes on and on for years and years, ladies and gentlemen, specifically in light of the analysis of Rohit Devi that they never once rebutted. We think that under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, we do much, much better for the post-conflict scenario in terms of their love towards the minority communities or in terms of the number of refugees that are created, ladies and gentlemen. We think we are superior. On the last aspect, ladies and gentlemen, as to what are the incentives of the international community, because that's the fundamental thing you need to recognize, ladies and gentlemen. Because we think on the first level, countries like Iran, for instance, aren't likely to intervene anymore, ladies and gentlemen, because they recognize on the first level that once we have an armed international intervention from abroad, most countries will back off. So countries like Russia, China and Iran will back off the moment there's an international armed intervention for a couple of reasons. Because they cannot afford open conflict. Because when you analyze the incentives of each of these countries, a country like Iran is already in a lot of trouble, ladies and gentlemen, with their nuclear program. They're already trying to negotiate with the international community. So the moment they see international armed presence in this region, they're going to back off. When you talk about Russia and China, ladies and gentlemen, these are countries that lose nothing in causing diplomatic stagnation in the UN. But they lose a lot if they go into an armed conflict, ladies and gentlemen. When you talk about China in the midst of a regime change, they cannot afford a sort of proxy war in this area. When you talk about Russia, who's just struggling with the poor economy, ladies and gentlemen, and also struggling with regime change issues, ladies and gentlemen, with lots of protests against Vladimir Putin, we think these countries will automatically back out, which means, ladies and gentlemen, we think we'll have a better chance of necessarily intervening successfully in Syria. We've proven to you, ladies and gentlemen, how in the long term we do much better in post-conflict scenario, how in the short term we stop the conflict. NTU1 is extremely proud to propose.